Land is the first step to us building a physical campus here in Apple Valley. And we believe that having a permanent ministry space here in Apple Valley is going to help us reach our town in exciting new ways. We are trusting God to lead us. We're trusting Him to provide.
Did you know that every year over 10,000 people come through this building for graduations and teacher in-service days and community funerals? And we're able to provide that luxury to our town because of the faithful giving of our people. And it's our plan and our hope that this year we're able to pay off Powell Auditorium so that we can keep our hometown advantage right here in Victorville.
This plot of land is being used for ministry already. Every Tuesday we come out here and pray for the area. Adding infrastructure will help us reach our area in a much more impactful way.
God has been so good to us here at the Hesperia campus by blessing us with such an awesome building. But things have been a little tight lately. By adding more classroom space, not only do we get our kitchen back, but we get more space where we can teach kids, students, and adults alike how to reach their oikos more effectively right here in this community.
All right. I got my shirt on still, just to be a team player and spirit of the campaign. I haven't taken it off all week. Just kidding. Actually, it's a new one. It's clean, so feeling pretty good. Anyway, how are you? I know. It happens. Let's just say thank you to our ushers, our wonderful teams at each of these sites. They've got copies of the notes. Raise your hand if you need a copy. They're ready to serve you. And we want to welcome our other sites, Apple Valley and Hesperia and Phelan. Thanks for joining us, coming into the house today for at least a little while, as we continue to process through the story of David and Goliath, as well as talk about this great campaign that we are in the middle of. Hometown advantage. You know, research indicates that there's a clear strategic advantage for a home team over a visiting team. And we broke that down last week, gave you some of the research and even why the researchers believe that that is true. But we believe here at High Desert Church that there's also a very clear spiritual advantage for people who experience life and worship in close proximity to one another. Every once in a while, a very terrible thing happens to a family and they have to leave the Victor Valley and move to some other part of the country that isn't nearly as lush and beautiful as ours. I actually do love the desert. It is beautiful in its own way. Now, the advice I give when people leave is not to do what people normally do. People normally go, they'll take a road trip or they'll fly out for a scouting trip to find a home to live in. And I know that's important. Homes are important to all of us. There might be a little different level of priority for a house for some than others, but it's an important thing to do, find a good place to live. But I always tell them to do this. Take your first scouting trip, go out there at least for 2 or 3 weekends, whether you can stay the whole time or come back and forth, but you need to find a good church. And then once you find a good church, draw a little circle around that location as to how far you feel you would be comfortable driving to church, and then find a house within that area. It's much easier to find a good house in proximity to the church you want to participate with than sometimes it is to find a good church in proximity to that house that you pick somewhere out in the boondocks. Now, see, this is a problem because some of you have young kids and then they grow up and they want to get involved more, and then you grow in your faith and you want to get involved more, but if you have to drive a half hour, what does the devil always throw as an obstacle? Oh, Mass can take so long. That's like an hour round trip. You're already commuting to work. And then what happens to your spiritual life? Goes in the tank. So anyway, proximity is important. And it's important to us here at HDC. Now take out your goals card. You got them in your programs. And we're reviewing this because we have people coming and going. And so we take a couple of weeks to just repeat ourselves for a few minutes, make sure everybody understands what's going on. We've got a few things we're going to accomplish in this campaign. We're going to get property for our Apple Valley site. Let's give it up for Apple Valley. Those people have been setting up and tearing down right there at Sitting Bull School, doing a great job out there, by the way, AV. But we want to get them a brick and mortar site so that they can be a little more permanent in their ministry. So we already have property in escrow. We've got about a little more than 13 acres in escrow right there on Yuckaloma. In a couple of months, we'll close escrow and we'll pay for that property because of y'all. Second thing, we want to position portable buildings on the 14-acre Phelan campus that we bought a couple of years ago. Now let's give it up for the Phelan folks because they also are setting up and tearing down. No, they deserve all the props we can give them. And they have a parcel now fairly close to where they're meeting at Quail Valley Middle School, and those portables will allow them to have midweek meetings and group meetings, and they'll still have services on the weekend at the school until we can get a little more action going over there on the Phelan site, but we're excited about that. And then we're going to add some classroom space to the Hesperia site. I joked last week that you can't hear them clapping because they're trying to get air. The oxygen in the room is getting sucked out by all the people in the room. But I will tell you this, it is a problem. I was joking, but it's still a problem. So Hesperia, we're coming. Calvary's coming. We're going to help out here. And then we're going to pay off this auditorium here in Victorville. We still have a small note on this property, going to take a relatively small percentage of the overall campaign goal, and we're going to pay off this building, so that'll be fun, okay? All right, this is one church. This is one campaign. We don't have 4 sites just kind of generating action for their own place. We are all for one, one for all, see? What does that make us, like the Oiksketeers? I don't know. That just came to me. It was a serendipitous moment that I just had. No other service got that profundity except for y'all. But we are all for one and one for all. And just like hundreds of families who may have visited here to see the Point Discovery building, but they attend a different site, and yet they supported our efforts here in Victorville so that our kids could have Point Discovery. So we are going to return the favor, and we're going to be there for the rest of the sites. We're all in this together. We are hand in hand, right? Yeah. You know what that means? That means hand in wallet, right? Okay, maybe not so many. Yeah, everybody's getting all jacked up about the hand in hand. How about hand in purse, hand on checkbook, hand in wallet? My dad used to say, he was a pastor, he always take the offering, and he's old school. He's great. Pastor Frank, he'd say, so take out a $20 bill and wrap it in a $100 bill and drop it in the offering. He was so great, but anyway, PF. All right, the options card. Let's see what you're going to respond with. Number 1, you're going to give. We're not asking you on this card to tell us what you're going to give, but if it is your heart to participate financially, check that box. And then you're going to pray for where you live, the community where you are worshiping and living. You're going to deepen your commitment to Jesus if you want to do that. If you say, Pastor Tom, this whole thing's about my becoming a more devoted follower of Jesus. I want to do that. Then check it. Invite my Oikos to HTC. Maybe you need to just raise your game in terms of representing Jesus and expressing your faith in Jesus to the people around you. Your Oikos, those 8 to 15 people, God is supernaturally and strategically placed in your life. And then if you have a story to share, you might say, I've got a hometown advantage. I've got a story about how a particular site being in my hometown actually transformed my life or the life of my family, maybe somebody in my Oikos. Check that box. And we're going to get those cards later if you didn't turn them in last week, and you'll hear all about that in a few minutes. Anyway, going to collect by August 31st, $1.5 million. You say, wow, that's a lot of money. It would take a miracle to collect that much money. Well, today you're going to find out this is not a miracle campaign. This will take 0 miracle. Doesn't mean every campaign is going to take a miracle, because there may be one coming down the road and say, yeah, that's going to take a miracle. This is not going to be a miracle. This is going to be obedience. And then you've got next the fund that many of you have given toward or participated in over the last few years. The next fund is designed, you can designate a gift, and that is put into a fund that helps us make capital investments in one of our 4 sites. And so that next fund is going away. Well, the fund's not going away, just the name. So if you want to continue giving to that fund, then you might just earmark your gift, Hometown Advantage, because that's what the name of the fund's going to be. Okay? All right. Well, that's 2 pages worth. We're also reflecting these weeks on the story of David and Goliath, one of the best known stories in the Bible. And last time we talked about accepting the challenge. And these 3 steps, today we'll talk about fighting the battle and the next time seizing the victory. But these 3 steps are not systemic only to a capital fundraising campaign. They certainly are not just an outline to help us better understand the confrontation between David and Big G. This is a 3-step process that we ebb and flow in and out of throughout our lives. Because we face so many challenges, right? Marriage is a challenge. It's about accepting a challenge. When you stood up on a stage, whenever you stood up on a stage, if you're married, and you said, I do, you were not just saying I do to him or to her. Your fiance then became your spouse. You said to God, I do accept this challenge. Because that's what marriage is. It's a challenge. Some of you weren't ready to accept the challenge, so you took a while to get married until you were ready. Some of you didn't want to accept the challenge. Some of you couldn't accept the challenge because you couldn't get a date. Anyway. After the challenge comes the what? The battles, right? And I'm not talking about battles with your spouse, although, we've all had a few of those. I'm talking about the battles that you have with yourself, with the person you look at in the mirror, because every time you accept the challenge to be married, what you're telling God is, I want to become more like you. Because I will tell you categorically, your marriage will not succeed very long unless you become more like Jesus. You got 2 options, grow up in your faith or find a good divorce attorney. Because that's what marriage is. It can be a battle. A lot of people want to accept the challenge for whatever reasons, and they choose not to fight the battle. And because they don't fight the battle, they don't get to run a victory lap and celebrate the victory of winning the battle. No, when I say marriage is a battle, I'm not saying it's not all good. Some of it's easy, some of it's fantastic, some of us I don't even have to preach about because you already know that's a perk. But then those things are very difficult. Well, you accepted the challenge, bro. It's time to fight the battle. And the battle is with you. You against you. The new you in Christ against the old man. The spirit against the flesh. Fight it. Because if you can win that battle with your pride, if you can win that battle with selfishness, that battle with greed, that battle with anger, then you're going to be able to seize the victory. Next time we'll talk about that. There's a little soapbox I got on for a minute, and I'm going to step down now. Chapter 17, 1 Samuel, chapter 17, verse 1. This is our text, just by way of review. Let's find out where we are. Let's just kind of reflect on David accepting the challenge. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war, assembled at Soko in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes-Dammim between Soko and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah, drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines, their arch enemies. Philistines occupied one hill. The Israelites occupied another hill. And there's an empty valley in between them as they just stood on those ridge lines and stared at one another. Neither had the nerve to attack the other. Neither were confident of victory. So they just watched. Nothing happened. And finally, the Philistines created a battle strategy that made them confident of a victory because one of their infantry soldiers was a dude named Goliath. He's 10-foot tall infantryman. In the ancient world, that strategy is called single combat. It's pretty prevalent in the ancient world, even mentioned a few times in the Old Testament besides here. The problem was the Philistines sent their guy, Goliath, but Saul, the king of the Jewish army, couldn't find any of his guys to be his guy. And that went on for 40 days while Goliath, verse 8, stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you even come out here and line up for battle? You ain't gonna fight. Why did you just come and watch? What? Nothing happens. Am I not a Philistine? Am I not your enemy? Am I not the obstacle that stands between you and actually possessing this land that you claim your God gave you? Come on, choose a man. Have him come down and fight me. Israelites, verse 25, have been saying, do you see how this man keeps coming out? Do you see how evil this man is? How sinful he is? Can you just imagine how nasty the world has become? People saying horrible things about God. You know what God's people have done for a long time? Nothing but this. And the king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. A lot of money. Look at this, celebrity wife, give him his daughter in marriage, and will exempt his family from taxes. Holy mackerel, that is a retirement package. And so young David comes, hopping down the trail, bringing supplies from his pops, Jesse, to give to those 3 oldest brothers who had been deployed with the Jewish army. So he shows up, drops off the supplies, goes out to the front lines to try to find his brothers. And he couldn't believe what he heard coming out of the mouth of this Philistine. He couldn't believe that the Israelite army would have the promise of such a great reward and the eternal Yahweh at their backs. And they just stand there and allow their doubts and their fears. And I don't know. Should we? I don't know. Staring at what? Nothing. And so it looks like Goliath's going to get the last word, doesn't it? Well, it looked that way until David finally had enough, and he said to King Saul, you know what he said? He said, put me in, coach. By the way, this campaign is exciting to me, not just because we're going to raise a bunch of money. It's exciting for me because I love you, and some of you are going to finally take an on-ramp into a life of generosity. It's going to be totally transformational. Many of you are going to give less than you should, actually much less than you could. But because you're going to give something, at the same time, you're going to find out that God is faithful. God is just faithful. Nothing my dad used to always tell churches he led. He'd say, you cannot outgive God. Nobody has ever been able to say, I gave God more than he gave me. Ever. But we have to stop standing on those ridge lines of our lives and just looking at where we all know we ought to be, fighting the battle. Like every ancient army, I told you last time, Saul's army had 3 categories of soldiers. He had the cavalry soldiers, the infantry soldiers, and the projectile warriors. And Goliath, who was challenging the Israelite army to send down a soldier, he was an infantryman himself, and he intended for Israel to send an infantryman to fight him. Unfortunately for Goliath, he didn't get one. He got a projectile warrior. And a skilled projectile warrior is always a problem for an infantryman. You know, David is perceived as the underdog in this narrative. And today you're going to find out that he was not the underdog at all. That he actually had the tactical advantage in the battle. He brought a distinct advantage into that conflict. But you're also going to learn that he wasn't Superman either. I just love the timing of these challenges. You know, God, in his divine wisdom, knows so much more than we do, and we plan these things, but only God could have planned to, on the first day of this campaign, drop a Super Bowl in our lap. And especially the one we saw. Did you see that game? Hey, Pastor Tom tell you who's going to win? I'm just saying. Okay, you can believe Pastor Tom. But the timing of it, For the last week, all we have been hearing is how David defeated Goliath. How Nick Foles of the Eagles, who was a backup quarterback, only played because the good quarterback was injured and couldn't show up. And he outdueled the greatest NFL quarterback of all time, Tom Brady. Okay. I know. Is that for them or is that for me? Because I was so insightful. I don't know. I don't know the difference, so we'll just leave it at that. But this is a quote, Foles. And I have to tell you, I love the game. And I know some of you didn't watch the game. Many of you did. I love the game. The game was fine. That was the best post-game interview set I have ever seen after a football game, as one after another testified about their faith in Jesus. You know what I did? I recorded the after game, and I've been watching the replays of all the interviews after the game. And one of the interviews went this way with Nick Foles, right? He said this, I quote, "I think the big thing that helped me was knowing I didn't have to be Superman. I have amazing teammates, amazing coaches around me, and all I had to do was go out and just play as hard as I could. Play for one another and play for those guys," end of quote. Here was a third-round draft choice out of college, University of Arizona, with a fairly average resume for the few years he's been in the league. A couple of years ago, he had to be talked out of retiring because he was so discouraged. And then he experienced what we watched him experience last week. You know what that is, folks? That's you. That's me. We're just people. We're just fairly average people. Some of us got drafted in the 10th round. Okay. We're just trying to get through the day without looking stupid. That's us. But you know what we've got? We've got this amazing coach. We've got this infallible playbook that we call the Bible. We got this, hold on, it gets better. We got this sincere desire and love for one another. We just want to play for each other. We don't have to be anything extraordinary here. We just have to be us. We just have to trust the coach and run the place. Okay, anyway, that was another soapbox. Let's go ahead and go to the fill in the blanks. Number one, here's a strategy to fight a battle effectively. Number one, be well prepared. Be well prepared. God had prepared David for this confrontation. You know, sometimes we don't get prepared for what we know we need to be prepared for because we know battles are coming. How many of you have young children at home? You got a child, let's say, anywhere from 2 to 10. Raise your hand. Okay, put your hand down. There's a battle coming. Wait a minute. I'm feeling the Holy Spirit inspiring me here. I'm gonna make a prediction. Y'all are gonna have to raise a teenager. You say, that's why I'm, senior pastor, I overstate the obvious. Can I ask you this, though? If you already know that battle's coming, why aren't you preparing for it right now? You know what people tell me? They say, Pastor, we got this teenager. Woke up one day, this teenager. We don't know what to do. Oh, why don't you know what to do? What have you been doing for the last 10 years? You knew this battle was coming, right? Do you understand how silly we can be? We don't even prepare for the battles we know are coming. And then we got battles we don't know are coming. And God prepares us while we're not even realizing it. That's what happened to David. God prepared him. He didn't know Goliath was ever going to be on his radar screen. Look at this. David asked the men, verse 26, standing near him, "What's going to be done to this man who kills the Philistine, removes this disgrace from Israel?" You can just sense his passion. Who is this? I just love this, man. This is called a rant. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Well, what David said, look down verse 31. What David said in verse 26 was overheard by somebody close to the king. So he went to the king and said, "Hey, king, we may have found your guy. He's pretty jacked up about this, and I think he can just run on adrenaline and probably beat be Goliath. And so Saul sent for David, and David shows up in the tent there, and he says, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine, because I am here. I am your servant, and I'm your humble servant. I'm going to fight the Philistine. And Saul replied, you can't fight the Philistine, Davy. You're only a young man. This guy's been killing people for as long as he's been alive. David said to Saul, well, okay, but I have been keeping my father's sheep. See, that's quite a warrior resume, isn't it? But it actually is, because look what happens next. He's still explaining to the king. Whenever a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock. Now, I have read this story like you, if you've read it as often as me, hundreds of times. I've read this story hundreds of times. It suddenly dawned on me, wait a minute. Are there lions in Israel? I've been to Israel. I've never seen a lion in Israel. I don't watch the news and see lions kind of crawling around the background as, the cameras are rolling. I don't know if there are lions in Israel, so I checked it out. There aren't any lions in Israel. Not anymore. Now, I don't know how many of those lions were killed by David, but I do know they're extinct from that region. They're on the endangered species list. The Asiatic lion used to be indigenous to Palestine. And David's telling Saul, oh, I killed them. And a bear, a Syrian brown bear. None of those in Israel anymore either, but there used to be. And what does he say in verse 35? Here is a lion, here is a bear with one of my sheep hanging from its jaws. I went after it. I said, hey, give me my sheep back. And I grabbed it. I struck it. I rescued the sheep from its mouth, and when it turned to put me in its jaws, I seized it by its hair, and I killed it. Okay, well, maybe you're a good choice. The Asiatic lion's a real interesting cat. It has a mane, not a real long mane like some of the lions that you see depicted in other parts of the world. It has a rather short mane, but certainly enough hair for David to grab it by its hair and to slit its throat. That's a shepherd. Those weren't distance kills. Those weren't kills because the animal was hit by a stone from David's sling. You know what he's telling Saul? He says, King Saul, you get me an arm's length of that giant, and I will kill him on any terms he wants to fight me, as long as I can reach his hair. It's like 10 feet tall. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be just like one of them. Hey, king, that lion and bear, their heads are hanging in my living room. This will be no different. Why? Because he has defied the armies of the living God, and nobody deserves to get away with that. Oh, by the way, when you read the end of the story, you can go to the last chapter of the Bible. Nobody gets away with that. Nobody gets away with nothing. If only if not for the grace of God, we would not get away with it either. And then I just love this. King, this is what he's saying. King, this guy is a threat to God's sheep. I know a few things about dealing with those kinds of situations. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion, the paw of the bear, will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. You know what God had been doing for David? Preparing him for this day. And I got to tell you, when that day came, there is no hesitation. David is ready. For the last few years, we've been focusing on ministry efforts we've called localization, kind of embedding our ministries in the 4 sites, the 4 communities where God has given us a footprint. But that step is only one of many over the last couple of decades. I remember I was in Providence, Rhode Island a couple of decades ago. Cheryl, my wife, and I were having dinner. It was actually the first time I was at a cheesecake factory 20 years ago in Providence, Rhode Island. And across the table is the head of our little denomination and his wife. And he said to me, he said, "Okay, Tom, so what's going on at High Desert Church?" And I said, "Well, I'm planning my escape." And he said, "Are you leaving the church?" I said, "Yes, I am. Not for a long time, but we need to change the way things are going, or else when I leave, it's going to be a bigger problem than we want it to be." And so we started to make a plan, change up what we did around here. Jim Collins gives advice in his book, Great by Choice. He says, fire bullets, then cannonballs. Fire bullets, then cannonballs. And for the last 18 years or 20 years since that dinner, what we have done intentionally here is starting to fire some bullets. Let me explain what that means, if I might. Picture this, and this is right out of his book. You're at sea, and a hostile ship is bearing down on you. You got a limited amount of gunpowder. You take all the gunpowder and you use it to fire a big cannonball. The cannonball flies out over the ocean, misses the target off by 40 degrees. So you turn to your stockpile and discover you're out of gunpowder. You die. You lost the battle. But suppose instead that when you see the ship bearing down, you take a little bit of gunpowder, you fire a bullet. It misses by 40 degrees. So you make another bullet and you fire, it misses by 30 degrees. So you make a third bullet and fire, and it misses by only 10 degrees. The next bullet hits the hull of the oncoming ship, clank. So now you take all the remaining gunpowder and fire a big cannonball along that same line of sight. Bam! You sink the ship, you live. Fire bullets, then cannonballs. You know, it's been an interesting journey getting from where we were a couple of decades ago, point A to point B. But these steps we've been taking have intended to do what we realized we needed to do. We needed to take the responsibility of success off of the shoulders of the senior pastor or even the key leaders of the church and begin sharing that load with not just dozens of others, but thousands of others across the valley. Some of you have been around a while and you remember some of the steps that we took, some of the bullets that we fired. You remember the term gen to gen? Generation to generation. We experimented with a ministry plan that divided the church into multiple worshiping entities, all having their own teaching pastor, all having their own staff team. And while we were all still here only on the Victorville site, we took a shot, another bullet we fired at delivering the weekend message from this room into another room on this campus via high-definition video screen. Well, Gen to Gen morphed into multiple site, where we took the video lessons that we learned here on our Victorville campus during those years, and we utilized that same delivery system at a completely different location across the Victor Valley. And what we learned at that site, we transferred to a second site, then to a third site, then to a fourth site. And then we took a step away from showing the Saturday night video that we generated from this stage in Victorville and just showing that video on Sunday mornings at our other sites. And we began live streaming every service at every site. And then we began the process of localization, asking each one of these 4 sites, are you that intentional about the communities where you're serving? And all the while, we employed a basic ministry philosophy that takes the burden of bringing people to Jesus off of the shoulders of the pastor where it was never intended to be. Understanding that 95% of the people who give their hearts to Jesus give their hearts to Jesus, not because of what a pastor does or says, but because of you and the way you demonstrate faith and discuss faith for those people and with those people in your oikos. As we took every one of those steps that I mentioned, and there were others, certainly in between some of those. But it's not that we always discovered what we thought we'd discover. But all along the way, we've been firing bullets. We knew that eventually we were going to have to fire a few cannonballs. We just wanted to make sure that when we did, we knew where to fire them. Well, I just want to make an official declaration today. $1.5 million is a cannonball. It's not as big as some will undoubtedly fire off in the years ahead. But it's certainly bigger than we'd have a right to fire had we not been firing bullets for the last 15 years. And again, the beauty of this thing is not just what we do corporately as a church, but what you as an individual or you have as a family have the opportunity to begin doing. You can begin firing your own bullets. It's just a campaign, lasts 6 months long. Take a step of faith and give something. I guarantee you that when you start firing bullets, financial bullets at God's kingdom, at some point down the line, God's going to give you the opportunity to fire a cannonball the same direction. And that's when life gets really, really fun. That's when you take victory laps. Because of how God's grace has so transformed your heart and how faith has surged in your spirit. Well, here's number 2. That's another soapbox. So let's keep moving. Number 2, employ extraordinary tactics. Extraordinary tactics. I mentioned how ancient armies were broken down in those 3 basic groups: cavalry, soldiers on foot, or, cavalry, soldiers on horses, or maybe in chariots. Infantrymen are the foot soldiers carrying swords and spears, and then projectile warriors who were the archers, the bow and arrow experts, and also the slingers, those who used a sling, as David did. He was a slinger. And I told you at close range, a skilled slinger never missed. I told you that last time. And so we see in verse 38, Saul dresses David in his own tunic, in Saul's tunic, and he puts a coat of armor on David and a bronze helmet on his head. And what is Saul doing in verse 38? He's trying to make an infantryman out of a slinger. Why? Because Saul knew that whoever fought Goliath was going to fight an infantryman. So it's just intuitive to say, you might as well send down an infantryman who can fight fire with fire. That might be an intuitive response. But here's a biblical principle. Worldly intuition sometimes is our greatest threat to success. As Paul, when he wrote the Corinthians, he said, we live in the world, but we don't use the same weapons the world does. We don't wage war like the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, we have power. We don't just have power to eliminate an outpost or to eliminate a particular battalion on a hillside. In Christ, we have the power to dismantle spiritual strongholds. We demolish arguments, every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, including Goliath. We take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. We fight differently than the world fights. Sometimes it's that logic, that world's intuitive logic that tries to kick in for you to solve the problems you face. The world says just get tougher. So you try to be the tough guy. Problem is you were never that tough anyway. Tried to make people think you were tough. That's why you work out. Tough. Get a new lift kit for your pickup truck. Brag about the new gun you purchased. And while there may be nothing necessarily wrong with any of those, none of them matter in the biggest battles that you have to fight in your life. Maybe the only battles you really ever have to win in your life. And that's the lesson here. Use extraordinary tactics, extraordinary arsenal that God has given us. Just start using weapons that have been designed by God to give you victory in those battles. And so David, verse 39, he fastened on his sword over the tunic and he started walking around because he wasn't used to them. I'd just love to have been a mouse in the corner watching David, just kind of walking around, stumbling around in this whole coat of armor. He says, I can't do this. And so he took them off. And Saul knew he couldn't do it. You notice Saul isn't saying, no, keep them on, because Saul's probably cracking up by now because David looks like an idiot. David's not an infantryman. David doesn't wear armor. Here's another spiritual lesson. Be who you are. That's the only person you got to be, is who you are. You can't be someone you're not. You're not big enough to win at the game of life. You're not tough enough to win the battles in your marriage using human wisdom, using your own strength, your own intuition, your own ideas. You need help. Good news is, in Christ, He's given you more than enough to secure the victory in every battle that you face. But you know what it takes? It takes faith. The world doesn't fight with faith. The world fights by sight. Some of you came into the room today completely defeated by emotional enemies. You're at the end of your rope. In fact, some of you, it's not a habit for you to come to church on a weekly basis. I don't know who you are. You're only here today because you're at the end of your rope. Some of you came into the room today completely defeated by financial enemies, completely defeated by physical enemies. You just named the enemy. You've been getting your tail whooped out there. You know, at the end of every one of these messages we preach, we give you the ABCs. You remember what the word is for A? Admit. Just like David told Saul. What did David tell Saul? I can't do this. I can't. David wasn't an infantryman. He was a slinger. So he took his staff in his hand. He chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag with his sling in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Because he believed God was believable. Do you believe God is believable? You do? Raise your hand if you believe God is believable at all these sites. Okay, now turn to the person next to you and say, seriously, you believe that? Because if you believe that God is believable, then why do we live our lives as if He's not believable? Get prepared. Get prepared. Get ready. The battles are coming. You don't even know what the battles are. You know what some are? You have no idea what others are going to be like. That's why you need to prepare now. Put the Word of God into practice. And by faith, load up your sling. And then recognize, number 3, recognize your strategic advantage. I told you this campaign will not require a miracle. And let me tell you why I said that. Because in these rooms today, there's already $1.5 million sitting in these rooms. God's already given the HTC family the money to move forward. The only question is, what are we going to do with the money? That's the only question. If every one of our family units, this is why it doesn't need a miracle. Look at this statistic. If every one of our family units gave $70 a month just for the next 6 months, $70 a month for 6 months, from now until the end of August, we'd exceed our $1.5 million goal. That's why it doesn't take a miracle. Most of you could and should give much more than that, because in a practical sense, we're all on the same team, but we don't play the same positions financially. Some of you are leadoff hitters. Others of you are cleanup hitters. God has given you a different place in life financially. And the fact that you're not a cleanup hitter doesn't give you an excuse to sit on the bench. Because we all have an opportunity to be a part of this roster. And we all have a very important role to play on this team. And every player on every roster on every team is expected to contribute. Expected to play when they're called. I've shared the metrics before. If every family at High Desert Church made a poverty level income, if everybody at HTC was impoverished with the amount of money that we made at our jobs, but we tithed, we followed the biblical directive to tithe. we would not be having a conversation ever at this church. And I could apply those same metrics to every church in the world. There would be no capital campaigns because just your regular tithes would fuel not only an annual budget, but every capital investment we would ever want to make. God's already given us a strategic advantage. And yet, how do we live our lives? We kind of mope about the fact that somehow we're in this situation where we have this financial disadvantage. The reason that Saul believed David had little or no chance to win was because Goliath was really big and had a lot of military experience, and David was relatively small and had no military experience. But David knew from the beginning he was not going after Goliath on Goliath's terms. He was going to fight Goliath on his terms, in the manner that God prepared. In the manner that God prepared him to fight. Verse 41, meanwhile, Philistine with a shield bearer in front of him kept coming closer to David. And you'll notice in this narrative, and you have to do this to really get a sense of what I'm saying, but when you read the whole story in succession, without commentary, without Pastor Tom chirping in every couple of verses, when you read the whole story in succession, you read time after time, mention after mention of the Philistine needing to get closer and closer and closer to David to fight him. Because infantrymen needed proximity to fight the battle the way they were trained to fight the battle. Projectile warriors didn't, which is why they held a strategic advantage over an infantryman. And I know we're all used to that term. Once again, David and Goliath. We're going to describe an underdog. We're going to describe a lesser opponent, somehow rising up to defeat what everyone believes to be the greater one. But David actually had the advantage here. One historian wrote this. This is a great quote. I love this stuff. No one in ancient times would have doubted David's tactical advantage once it was known he was an expert in slinging. Oh, he's a slinger? Oh, no. Another historian said this, Goliath had as much of a chance against David as any Bronze Age warrior would have had against an opponent armed with an automatic .45 pistol. What does that tell you? Disadvantage David is actually what? Advantage David. And it's not just his size that made it a problem for him as an infantryman because he was not able to maneuver. He had to get close. But that size also indicates something else about Goliath. Stanley Speecher is a doctor, and he was writing in a radiology journal for a group of secular doctors. He was writing about Goliath and the condition he undoubtedly suffered from. A pituitary malfunction caused him to grow to 9 foot 9 inches tall. And that condition, the doctor said, induces visual field deficits, which here's in my vernacular means Goliath couldn't see too good. The shield bearer was doing double duty. Undoubtedly, with one hand, he's carrying the shield. You know what he was doing with the other hand? He was leading Goliath to the arena of battle because his field of vision was so impaired. David had not the disadvantage here, he actually had the advantage. So here, with his limited vision, Goliath looks David over, saw he was little more than a boy, glowing with health, handsome, and he hated him. He sees the shape of a warrior, and he says to David, am I a dog, boy? You bringing your puppy dog? You gonna play fetch? It's not what I'm here for. Come here. I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. Now, we already know David is not in a good mood. And it continues. He says this, you come against me with sword and spear? Bro, you see the sling here, right? I don't even need that. I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have been so foolish as for 40 days, every morning, every night, to defy his name. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down, and I will, he's not mincing words here, I will cut off your head. This very day, I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army. And they all heard him. To the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that God saves us. The battle is not mine. The battle is not yours. The battle doesn't belong to any of y'all. Battle is the Lord's. As the Philistine moved closer, there you go, moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. And remember what I told you about a slinger at close range. He's lethal. And he reached into his bag, and he took out a stone, and he struck the Philistine on the forehead, and the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground, did a face plant in the valley of Elah. Can you imagine the drama? Can you imagine being a Philistine soldier watching that? Can you imagine being a member of the demonic legion, sitting up on the ridgeline, watching High Desert Church fight the battle the way we were designed to fight it, and looking for some place to hide because we decided to come out of our shells and accept a challenge and fight a battle because we say God is believable. I totally believe in miracles, so don't tell me that I'm taking away from the miraculous nature of this story by saying David had the advantage. This is not a miraculous depiction here. But God still is very intentional in superintending all of these events. God's involved here. Even though it's not a miracle, God is involved here. A miracle, by definition, is what happens when God overrides the natural laws he already engineered to accomplish a very specific purpose in a very specific setting. But most of the things that you and I claim are miraculous in our lives are not miracles at all. They might be to us because some of you are not familiar with the systems that God built. He built amazing systems. And when you operate within them, good things happen. And when you operate outside of them, that's when you need a miracle. But you and I just need to live inside the parameters of the divine reality we already occupy. Just be like David, say, I can't fight that way. I can only fight one way, by faith. And then prepare like David was prepared. Do what God has prepared you to do. Understand who you are in Christ and just follow him. Follow him by faith. And you will never, ever, ever be at a disadvantage. Oh man, I'm tired. So we got the leads coming back. Let's give it up for your leads.